Okay, let's practice making lines using a value scale and trying to achieve different values, meaning darks, mediums, and lights. So I've set 4 different scales with 5 blocks in each scale. I'm first working with hatching. Hatching is a type of line that's vertical, but they're not straight up and down like you would have your parallel lines, so they slightly cross over into each other. I like to start with a line that's a little bit short, I would say slightly over, between 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 of an inch in height. And then make sure you're using, I like to practice using the same pencil or even a fine tipped pen. Make sure your pencil tip is sharpened. The duller it gets, the wider the lines are. And so I like to keep that nice and sharp. And how I achieve darker lines, if you'll notice that first square, I make sure my lines are closer together. And I'm not reefing on the pencil. I'm not pushing super hard, but I have a nice medium pressure. And then it's all about layers. I just layer and layer and layer those lines closer together and on top of each other. And so as you try and get a lighter shade using the line, I'm using less pressure. I'm drawing my lines slightly farther apart and I layer less. And so it's really not difficult. But a couple tips that I've found over the years doing this, I'm doing scribble line now, and you'll see that I'm going to do my first 2 blocks with my first layer of scribble lines because that first block is going to be my darkest one. But you'll notice that did my base layer in 2 squares, and then I'm going to take and just tighten up those lines, those scribble lines, and then layer and layer and layer till I get the darker value. And then I'm going to go to my middle square. So that's why I did that. You don't have to do it that way. You'll notice I start getting looser with my scribble lines as I go, and then I'm barely skipping the page, always in that lightest value square, so that I get really, really light, barely any value shown. And then your next value would just be your highlight where you don't have any shade at all, where you're not using any of your technique or lines or shading. So we're going to go to cross hatching. Cross hatching, I will see the mistake where kids will fill in the entire square with the up and down vertical and side to side horizontal, where cross hatching isn't that. You're making tiny little crosshatch shapes, and the smaller and tighter the lines are, again, the darker the value. And then I'm just changing direction constantly and adding more layers until it almost is solid. The only thing I would say that you can kind of struggle with using line for value instead of just straight up shading is it's hard to keep those lines within the box. And so as you go, if it gets out of the box, out of the, if you cross the lines so that you're basically coloring outside of the lines, just take your eraser at the end and erase and tidy those up. So cross hatching again, the second square where I'm lightening up my value slightly, I'm just going to keep the same technique, but I'm not going to layer as much. And in between, I will sharpen my pencil tip. Sometimes I'll go back through a previous layer and darken it up. That's why I like starting with my darkest value instead of my lightest value, but that's not right or wrong, it's just preference. I am right-handed, and so I like to work left to right so I don't have my hands smudging into my values as I work. That's something to think about as well. So it doesn't mean you have to start with your darkest value to the left and then have your lightest value on the right. If you want to do opposite, that's great as well. Now, I always make sure on that lightest value that I have sharpened the tip of my pencil because it is a little bit harder with a dull pencil tip to create a really light value that way. Now I'm going to end using wavy line. Now wavy line, I like to show this technique solely because it's a pattern of an original line shape that you repeat over and over and over. And the tighter you draw the lines together, the darker their value is. So there's no layering and changing directions. It's just all about having a sharp tip and drawing those lines closer and then farther apart. Pressure adds as well. So, I did use more pressure in my darker values, and then you'll see this lightest value. It was very lightly, I didn't put a lot of pressure on that. Label your work just so in the future you can remember if you're handing this in as an assignment. That's always important to label. I will get assignments and not understand what line is what. Good luck. This is a fun exercise.